Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. They were not always metal husks stalking through the void. Long before the galaxy trembled at the sight of Necron legions, there existed a race of frail, brilliant beings, sorrowful, proud, and cursed from birth. The Necrontyr were not monsters. They were a people burdened by pain, desperate to defy the cruel fate that had shaped them. Their bones burned under a dying sun, and their every achievement was tinged with the bitter realization that they would not live to see its legacy. Their fall was not a plunge into evil. It was a slow, agonizing surrender to hopelessness. We speak of an ancient era, so old it predates even myth. The Necrontyr were not born into horror. They were forged by it. They built wonders across the stars, carried by a will to escape their suffering, yet they could never outrun the decay that stalked them. Their tale is one of tragedy, not villainy. To understand who they were is to look into the eyes of a doomed people, too proud to yield, too broken to heal. The skeletal silence of the Necrons hides the agonized whispers of the Necrontyr, and if you listen closely, you can still hear them. The Necrontyr were born beneath a sky that offered no mercy. Their cradle world was bathed in the cruel radiance of a volatile, aging star, a stellar furnace that drenched the surface in deadly radiation. The planet itself was a barren expanse, windswept and harsh, offering no refuge from the torment of its sun. This place did not nurture life, it tortured it. The Necrontyr emerged into this crucible, their bodies frail and racked by illness from the moment of birth. Every Necrontyr lived under the certainty of a short, agonizing life, marked by slow decay and the ever-looming shadow of premature death. This unrelenting cosmic punishment forged a species obsessed with mortality. Death was not a distant concept for them. It was immediate, intimate, and ever-present. Their civilization evolved around this shared doom. The Necrontyr did not fear death because of some metaphysical dread. They hated it because it was real, inescapable, and cruelly unjust. Their ancestors died young. Their leaders withered away, despite power and knowledge. Great minds flickered and went dark before their potential could be realized. Unlike other species who could dream of long futures, the Necrontyr dreamed only of finding ways to delay the inevitable. And yet, within this suffering they built. Driven by despair, they reached toward the stars, not with joy, but with rage. Their science was aggressive, focused, and born of desperation. Every medical advancement, every architectural marvel, every spacecraft, they were all expressions of defiance against the tyranny of their own biology. They cataloged the mechanisms of death with a scholar's rigor and a mourner's bitterness. The very bones of their cities reflected this aesthetic. Angular monuments carved into the sides of cliffs, black obelisks that defied the sun's poison glare, and cryptic stelae etched with elegies for those who had never truly lived. Despite their technological brilliance, the Necrontyr were never free. Their world was a mausoleum long before their bodies turned to metal. Even at the height of their pre-ascension civilization, the Necrontyr remained haunted. They reached for the stars not in triumph, but in search of escape. Their colonization of other worlds was less about dominion and more about desperation. But the stars did not offer them peace. Even on distant planets, the radiation-borne sickness followed them. It was not the star alone, it was something within them, perhaps encoded in their very souls. Their curse was inescapable. This cosmic injustice became the root of their cultural character. Bitterness ran deep in their veins. They looked at other species, less advanced, less intelligent, yet free of suffering, and saw cosmic favoritism, a cruel joke played by the universe. They did not turn to mysticism or hope. The Necrontyr were rational, scornful of spiritual delusions. They turned instead to monument building, to mathematics, to the cold permanence of stone and data. If they could not outlive death, they would immortalize their names, etching their existence into the skin of reality itself. This existential wound did not merely shape individuals, it permeated every institution. Families became dynasties, not to preserve bloodlines, but to preserve memory. Science became a sacred right. Each new theory another weapon in the war against entropy. Even art was a cry of defiance. The Necrontyr sculpted sorrow into obsidian, painting their cities with symbols of decay, struggle, and the slow erosion of hope. It was not beauty they pursued, it was permanence. Against the great cosmic eraser that was time, permanence was their only dream. But every civilization dreams of more. In the Necrontyr, this yearning became toxic. Their genius was real, but it was built on a foundation of pain, and pain twists all it touches. The brilliance that allowed them to master interstellar travel was the same brilliance that slowly, inevitably, steered them toward damnation. As their reach grew, so too did their anger. Why should they, who had suffered so much, bow to the natural order? Why should they accept death when others lived unburdened? Beneath every innovation lay a deeper question. How can we end the tyranny of time? It is here, in the blistered ruins of their birth world and the radiation-soaked bones of their ancestors, that the Necrontyr's tragic fate was first written. They did not begin as conquerors or monsters. They began as victims of the universe, screaming at a sky that refused to answer. But in time, that scream would become something else. Something eternal. Imagine a city carved from obsidian, built not to inspire awe, but to defy oblivion. Towering monuments lined its avenues, not of heroes or saints, but of scholars, scientists, and dying children, all immortalized before their time. That was the heart of Necrontyr civilization. A funerary culture masquerading as an empire. Everything they created, they did so with death in mind. Unlike other species who celebrated birth or triumph, the Necrontyr celebrated defiance in the face of decay. They did not live in a society obsessed with life. They lived in one obsessed with not dying. Theirs was a civilization that functioned like a great mausoleum. Every institution had one purpose: to outlast the inevitable. The Necrontyr Empire, even before biotransference, was structured not around joy, trade, or exploration, but around the cold calculus of legacy. Their dynasties functioned as extended memorials. A noble line's worth was not in its achievements, but in how long it could preserve its founder's name in the minds of others. Tombs were built larger than palaces, and archives more vast than marketplaces. Even in their most vibrant cities, there was the heavy silence of mourning. Architecture, too, was a reflection of this ethos. Their structures reached like black spines into the sky, hardened against time and wear. They built downward as well as upward, carving massive necropolis beneath their settlements, tunnels lined with sarcophagi, libraries of the dead that stored not just remains but data. Memories, personalities, fragmented identities. The Necrontyr never feared technology, as later human civilizations would. To them, machines were sacred, not for what they could do, but for how long they could endure. The permanence of circuitry and stone was preferable to the weakness of flesh. Social hierarchy was rigid, but not barbaric. There was no hunger for conquest among the Necrontyr, at least not at first. When ambition existed was directed inward, toward self-mastery and knowledge. Every citizen, regardless of caste, was expected to contribute to the struggle against entropy. Scholars were venerated more than soldiers, archivists more than artisans. Those few who delved into aesthetics did so through the lens of memorialization, painting murals of ancestral grief, composing symphonies of terminal illness and stellar decay. Even their children were taught early the bitter truth of their existence. You will not live long, so make your suffering matter. Medicine, naturally, became a quasi-religious institution. The most respected figures in Necrontyr society were the Thanateks, doctors, yes, but also philosophers, historians, and undertakers. They recorded not just the medical failures of their patients, but their thoughts, last wishes, philosophical musings. The Thanateks believed that death, though inevitable, could be made meaningful if chronicled correctly. A person who died unrecorded was a tragedy. A person who died without contributing to the archive was a sin. Through them, the Necrontyr sought not to cheat death, but to codify it, control it, rob it of its mystery. Still, beneath this solemn exterior, a slow pressure built. Not all Necrontyr accepted this static march into oblivion. The younger generations, bitter and brilliant, began to question. What good were archives if they only recorded extinction? What use was memory if no living being remained to remember it? Dissent simmered, not as rebellion, but as a cold, intellectual fury. They began to look outward. If they could not cure their affliction at home, perhaps they could find salvation among the stars. Thus began the long, grim push toward stellar colonization. Colonial expeditions were not voyages of discovery. They were flights from fate. Entire generations volunteered to vanish into the void, establishing enclaves on distant planets in the hope that new suns might be kinder. But the sickness followed. Even on verdant worlds with stable stars, the Necrontyr succumbed to the same slow degeneration. The realization struck with terminal clarity. Their curse was within them. Their society did not fracture, but it darkened. The archives filled with records of failed colonies. The libraries grew quieter. The Thanatechs began to speak of the hollow path, a philosophy that embraced extinction as art. Cultural despair took root. Ritualized suicide became an accepted, even honored, conclusion for those who felt their work complete. Dynasties began to collapse inwards, their leaders choosing to be interred with their records rather than risk being forgotten. Some attempted desperate experiments, merging biology with machinery, but all failed, too crude, too unstable. And still the stars turned cold above them. Hope had not died in Necrontyr civilization. It had been embalmed, laid in a tomb of black data and left to gather dust. And yet, for all its morbidity, there was an undeniable beauty to it all. The Necrontyr did not go gently into that long night. They raged in their own way, quietly, methodically, with code and carving and interstellar ambition. Their tragedy was not that they gave in to death, but that they gave everything to resist it and failed. They were a civilization in mourning from the moment of birth, and everything they built was a monument to that single cruel truth. They lived not for life, but for legacy. And it was that very yearning for permanence that would one day be their undoing. Sarek was not the first silent king, but he would be the last to bear that ancient title while still bound by flesh. Before his rise, the Necrontyr dynasties were a fractious, quarrelsome sprawl. Hundreds of noble houses locked in ceaseless rivalries that echoed across the stars. Each dynastic lineage claimed superior purity, ancient rights, or divine relevance in the long war against death. These rivalries did not take the form of open war, for such was inefficient and wasteful. Instead, the dynasties waged wars of prestige, architectural contests, scholarly competitions, and strategic colonization races. But beneath the ceremonial civility, the hatred ran deep. Sarek's dynasty, the Sarekhan, was one of the oldest and most influential, but it had long been considered aloof, more philosophical than pragmatic. Sarek himself was viewed by many as too contemplative, too melancholic for leadership. He did not speak often, and when he did, his words carried the weight of prophecy. Yet it was precisely this introspection that would become his greatest weapon. He did not seek to rule the Necrontyr out of ambition. He stepped into power because no one else had the vision to see the storm that was coming. By the time Sarek ascended, the dynastic strife had begun to rot the heart of Necrontyr civilization. The Thanatechs warned of cultural collapse, of dynasties forgetting even why they had begun to mourn. The archives had become bloated with repetition. The noble houses grew obsessed with minutiae, endlessly reinterpreting ancient grievances, turning history into a weapon. Sarek saw clearly what others could not. The Necrontyr were cannibalizing their own legacy. Inward fury would soon eclipse outward desperation. And so he moved, not with armies but with decrees, emissaries, and terrible truths. He invoked an ancient clause in Necrontyr law, that in times of existential peril, the Silent King could act unilaterally, binding all dynasties under one will. Most thought this clause ceremonial. Sarek proved otherwise. He began by shaming the dynasties, exposing the futility of their rivalries. He unearthed records of failed colonies, displayed statistical projections of extinction, and forced even the proudest nobles to confront the inevitability of their doom. One by one, he shattered their pride with numbers, evidence, and a vision so bleak that resistance felt absurd. He did not rule with fear. He ruled with sorrow. And that made him unassailable. Sarek's power did not stem from charisma or dominance. It came from his ability to articulate the pain every Necrontyr carried. He spoke of the legacy they would never leave, of children buried before they could speak, of knowledge dying in dusty vaults. He did not promise salvation. He promised unity in the face of the abyss. It was not hope that unified the Necrontyr under his rule. It was despair, finally given a voice. Once unified, Sarek began reshaping their civilization with quiet ferocity. The dynasties were not dissolved, but restructured. They retained autonomy in internal affairs but answered to a central command. He formed the Triarch, 3 high lords including himself, to oversee the survival of their race. The Thanatechs were elevated, given unprecedented authority to coordinate scientific efforts. Colonial expansion was resumed, but with tighter focus. Instead of seeking new homes, they began to search for answers. For weapons, for truths hidden in the fabric of reality itself. Some resisted. A few dynasties declared secession, viewing Sarek's unity as tyranny. They were crushed not by war but by deliberate isolation. Cut off from resources left to fester, they withered. Sarek made no move to reclaim them. He allowed them to rot in their arrogance, letting their collapse serve as a living lesson. Eventually, their remnants begged for reintegration. He accepted without vengeance, treating them not as enemies, but as wayward mourners returned to the fold. And all the while, Sarek watched the stars. He knew that unity alone would not be enough. The Necrontyr had fought entropy for generations and lost. To win now, they needed something beyond science. They needed a miracle, or something close enough. Rumors had begun to spread of entities that lived within the stars themselves. Not myths, not gods, but ancient, radiant intelligences. Sarek did not believe in gods, but he believed in leverage. He saw in these rumors a path not to glory but to vengeance, against the universe, against the laws of nature, against the very stars that had birthed their suffering. The dynasties followed him, not because they believed he was right, but because they could no longer believe in anything else. Sarek gave their despair purpose. And as the Necrontyr turned their gaze toward the cosmic stage, unified at last, a slow and terrible momentum began to build. The stars had wronged them, and the Silent King would see them judged. But in that judgment, something far worse was already watching. And waiting. Even at the apex of their unity, the Necrontyr could not escape the emptiness clawing at the heart of their civilization. Their worlds were countless, their technology unmatched among mortal races, but all of it was hollow. They moved across the stars like shadows, not conquerors but mourners. Each new colony was a shrine, each fleet a funeral procession. They had built an empire, yes, but it was an empire built to mourn itself. And what an empire it was. Spanning thousands of systems, the Necrontyr constructed a web of star lanes and fortified nodes that connected their worlds with chilling efficiency. Their command of physics allowed them to master inertia suppression, gravitational tethering, and other forgotten sciences that gave them strategic supremacy. Their fleets were sleek, dark, and unyielding, more like weapons of silence than vessels of exploration. Entire planets were converted into mausoleum worlds, floating testaments to the inevitability of decay. But for all their power, they had no joy in conquest. The Necrontyr did not fight to expand. They fought to find something, anything, that could deliver them from the sickness embedded in their genes. The stars they conquered were dissected, their radiation analyzed, their gravity wells charted. But every system brought disappointment. No cure, no safe haven, no sun untouched by entropy. The empire became a reflection of its makers, vast, cold, beautiful in its solemnity, but ultimately doomed. The Silent King, Sarek, began to sense the cracks beneath the unity. The Thanatechs reported rising despair among the scholar castes. Archivists began abandoning their posts, their work unfinished. Young nobles turned to extremes, some embracing nihilism, others reviving extinct mysticisms, desperate for meaning. Even the Triarch's most loyal agents whispered of a civilization that had reached its limits. They had conquered everything they could reach, and still the sickness remained. The curse, it seemed, was cosmic. It was in this climate of growing desperation that the Necrontyr first encountered the Old Ones. A species of near-limitless psychic power, the Old Ones were ancient even by Necrontyr standards. They seeded life across galaxies, shaped ecosystems with a thought, and wielded the warp like an artist wields a brush. Where the Necrontyr sought control through science and data, the Old Ones danced through reality with intuition and grace. They were everything the Necrontyr were not. Eternal, thriving, and untouched by the cruel grip of mortality. Contact was inevitable. Diplomacy was not. At first, the Necrontyr sought only knowledge. They approached the Old Ones with cautious deference, not humility, but curiosity. They demanded access to their secrets, their technologies, their biological wonders. But the Old Ones refused, not out of malice, but condescension. To them, the Necrontyr were children playing with dark tools they did not understand. Worse, they saw the Necrontyr's desperation as a threat. a volatile race fueled by death, poised to unbalance the cosmic harmony they so carefully curated. The Necrontyr, already wounded by their own suffering, could not bear this dismissal. Their plea for help had been met with rejection, not just rejection, but a reminder of their inferiority. Their bitterness, long simmering, ignited. It was no longer about curing a disease, it became a matter of vengeance. Thus began the war in heaven, not with battleships or invasions, but with sabotage, assassination, and ideological subversion. The Necrontyr turned their scientific genius toward destruction. They created weapons to shatter matter at the subatomic level, temporal disruptors, entropic cascades that erased entire civilizations from causality. The Old Ones responded with psychic monstrosities, engineered life forms and manipulations of space-time so profound they ruptured reality itself. But it was not a war the Necrontyr could win. The Old Ones were not simply more powerful, they were timeless. The Necrontyr, despite all their might, remained bound by decay. Their leaders aged, their warriors died. Their fleets required time, effort, and logistics. The Old Ones willed armies into existence. They spoke to the stars and the stars obeyed. Against such an enemy, even the most advanced empire was but a momentary flame. Still, the Necrontyr fought on, not because they believed in victory, but because surrender was worse. To admit defeat would be to accept their inferiority, their irrelevance. And so the war stretched into millennia, a slow erosion of both sides, but especially of the Necrontyr. Their empire, so carefully unified, began to splinter. Colonies fell silent. Dynasties vanished. Entire worlds became tombs, not by design, but by attrition. And yet, in the heart of this ruin, a whisper began to grow. There were beings, it was said, older than the Old Ones. Beings born not of flesh or thought, but of energy itself. The star gods, the Tan. They were not myths, they were real. And some among the Necrontyr began to believe they had found their deliverance at last. If the stars had cursed them, perhaps the stars themselves could be made to answer. But what the Necrontyr did not yet understand was that there are worse fates than death. The Necrontyr had spent countless generations looking outward for answers, combing the stars for cures, for allies, for understanding. And when none came, they turned inward, where only despair waited. But then came the whispers of the Cetan, celestial entities of radiant majesty, living minds born in the heart of stars, godlike and eternal. Where the Old Ones refused the Necrontyr, the Cetan came willingly. They offered power, understanding, and most importantly, immortality. For a dying race, the temptation was irresistible. But the Cetan did not come to heal. They came to feed. The first contact was tentative, almost reverent. The Necrontyr had no religion, but they were not without awe. The Cetan appeared as vast beings of energy and will, impossible to comprehend. They did not communicate in words, but in impulses, visions, gravitational waves of intent. Sarek and his Triarch knew they were dangerous, but they also believed they were controllable. The Necrontyr had mastered matter, they reasoned. Why not energy? And so began the greatest gamble in the history of their species. The Necrontyr forged bodies of living necrodermis to contain and interact with the Cetan. This metallic substance, shaped by arcane sciences, allowed the star gods to take form, to exist in real space, to be seen and known. In doing so, the Necrontyr gave the Tan a shape, and the Cetan gave the Necrontyr false hope. Each star god appeared as a different facet of cosmic truth. One embodied entropy, another hunger, another cold logic. They were mirrors of the Necrontyr's own fractured soul, and slowly they began to speak of a way to escape death forever. Biotransference, that was the word. A process of total transformation, converting the Necrontyr's weak, dying flesh into immortal metal. A new kind of existence, one not bound by age or decay. The Cetan claimed it was the key to everything the Necrontyr had ever wanted. But the price was never clearly stated. Sarek hesitated. Some Triarchs opposed the notion, calling it madness, heresy even. But others were too far gone. The thought of never dying was too powerful, too seductive. To the people, the promise of biotransference was a revelation. Propaganda swept across the dynasties. Visions of ageless bodies, of endless time, of pain erased. The Cetan spoke directly to the nobility, whispering dreams of godhood, of eternal empires unshackled by entropy. Sarek, torn by doubt and bound by duty, finally gave the order. The machinery was built. The stars grew dark with smoke and energy. The Necrontyr stepped forward to embrace eternity. But biotransference was not transcendence. It was slaughter. The process was agony. Entire populations were herded into transformation chambers. Their bodies were torn apart at the molecular level. Minds scanned, copied, reduced. Most lost everything in the process: identity, emotion, memory. What emerged were soulless machines, mockeries of their former selves. Only a handful retained self-awareness, and even they were haunted by the fragments of who they once were. The C'tan did not care. In fact, they reveled in the suffering. They fed on the energy released in the agony of transformation, growing stronger with every soul extinguished. Sarek watched in horror as his people were consumed. He had not saved them, he had betrayed them. The Necrontyr were gone. The Necrons had been born. The C'tan walked among them now as gods, not allies, and the Silent King saw too late the scale of his mistake. The price of immortality had been their very essence. They had escaped death, yes, but only by becoming something less than alive. No hunger, no love, no pain, but no joy, no memory, no soul. It was the most terrible of ironies. The Necrontyr had sought to conquer death, and in doing so, they had killed themselves. All that remained were echoes in metal, empty minds bound to silent tombs, animated by fragments of shattered personality. And above them, the C'tan feasted, their betrayal complete. The gods had not saved the Necrontyr. They had devoured them. Yet Sarek did not fall into madness. He saw the truth, and he began to plan. Because even gods can die. There is no greater silence in the galaxy than that which follows the death of a soul. After biotransference, the Necrontyr were no longer beings of pain, but neither were they beings of life. The Necrons, metallic husks animated by fragmented minds, possessed neither heartbeat nor breath. They moved through their tombs and across the stars with cold efficiency, no longer suffering, but no longer dreaming. And in that hollow quiet, Sarek and his most trusted lieutenants realized the scale of what had been lost. The war had not ended. It had simply changed shape. The Necrons in their new forms were weapons unlike any the galaxy had seen. They did not eat, sleep, or age. Their minds, stripped of distractions, could process tactics, mathematics, and spatial geometry at levels unthinkable to any organic intelligence. A Necron army could wake from millennia of dormancy and resume a battle in the exact formation it had been frozen. But while their bodies were perfect, their minds were not. Most had lost all memory. Others retained only fragments, dreams of dying suns, whispers of lost children, symbols etched into their consciousness with no understanding of what they meant. A few, very few, kept their full minds intact. These were the lords and overlords, twisted echoes of once great Necrontyr nobles. They wielded immense power, but most had gone mad, obsessed with ancient vendettas or lost honor. Sarek himself remained lucid, but the burden of his failure weighed heavily upon him. He had saved his people from death but condemned them to unfeeling eternity. The C'tan, now fully embodied in necrodermis shells, roamed the galaxy as living gods. They cared nothing for the plight of the Necrons. To them, their servants were tools, extensions of will. They demanded worship not out of arrogance, but hunger. The C'tan consumed souls, consumed stars, consumed memory itself. They made sport of reality, reshaping worlds according to alien whims. For a time, the Necrons obeyed. Their programming, forged during biotransference, bound them to the star gods. And yet the echoes of Necrontyr brilliance remained. It was not rebellion that ended the C'tan's dominion. It was revenge. Slowly, methodically, Sarek rallied those few minds still capable of understanding. He found lords who remembered just enough to hate. He found cryptecs who had hidden fragments of forbidden science. And together, in the shadow of their gods, they began to plan. The betrayal of the Tan would be answered not with fury, but with precision. The Necrons would become the instruments of justice against their creators. What followed was a war unlike any other, a reversal of cosmic roles. The slaves turned against the gods. The Necrons shattered the C'tan into shards, breaking their once invincible forms into millions of imprisoned fragments. Some were bound into weapons, others into machines, others left to drift in agony across the void. The star gods did not die in the way mortals understand death, but they were undone. It was not mercy, it was vengeance cold as the vacuum. Yet even in victory, there was no joy. The Necrons had no souls to savor revenge. Their empire, though restored in strength, was a ruin in spirit. Sarek stood among his soulless legions, the last true mind among the silent dead, and saw nothing worth ruling. He issued his final decree. The Necrons would sleep. Their tomb worlds would shut, their fleets would dock, their minds would go dormant. Perhaps, in some distant future, they would find a way to restore what had been lost. Perhaps not. But until that day, they would not burden the galaxy with their grief. And then he left. Sarek, silent king of the Necrontyr, now ruler of a race of machines, exiled himself. He took a small fleet and vanished into the void, vowing never to return until a path had been found. A path to redemption, to meaning, to some flicker of what once was. He became a ghost in the stars, watching, waiting. And behind him, the Necrons slept, locked in tombs that hummed with cold purpose, dreaming dreams they could no longer understand. What was gained in the war against death? A galaxy now haunted by the walking dead. What was lost? Everything. The Necrontyr had not just transformed their bodies, they had unmade their very essence. Their culture, their art, their sorrow, all turned to static echoes inside metal skulls. The war had been won. But the people who had fought it were gone. And in the silence of the tomb worlds, a single question remains. Was it worth it? Among the legions of Necrons, amidst the circuitry and necrodermis, something strange sometimes stirs, a hesitation in movement, a pattern in speech, a pause before execution. These are not malfunctions. They are echoes, remnants, ghosts. Beneath the rigid protocols and cold machine logic, there are still traces of the Necrontyr. Traces of who they once were, not in full memory, but in gestures, in obsessions, in inexplicable habits that should not exist in beings of pure code. The Necrontyr are gone, and yet they are not. One does not need to look far to find these spectral fingerprints. Take, for instance, the Necron overlords who insist on elaborate rituals before battle. These rites, devoid of tactical value, are echoes of ancestral ceremonies once held by Necrontyr dynasties. Some demand that specific hieroglyphs be carved into the battlefield, or that enemy leaders be addressed with formal speech before engagement. These behaviors serve no strategic purpose, but they are compulsions driven by fragments of forgotten identity. There are cryptechs, too, who exhibit eccentricities that no algorithm can explain. Some obsessively catalog battlefield data in structures that resemble pre-imperial Necrontyr memorial archives. Others display a fixation with artistic symmetry in their constructs, building pylons and obelisks according to ancient Necrontyr aesthetic ratios. Even flayed ones, those terrifying aberrations, are not free of this past. Their madness, driven by corrupted protocols, may in fact be a manifestation of suppressed memories, a grotesque mimicry of biological life, as if some part of them still longs to feel. The most poignant examples, however, are found in the tombs themselves. Necron architecture bears the unmistakable style of the Necrontyr. Massive archways, intricate statuary, and endless rows of sarcophagi, all marked with dynastic sigils that predate biotransference. Some tombs even house inert, ceremonial skeletons, effigies of family members, advisors, and children, maintained in stasis. These are not strategic assets, they are grief made metal. The Necrontyr may have died screaming, but their mourning continued into eternity. There are accounts, rare, whispered among the Imperium's more reckless scholars, of Necrons who pause before ancient ruins, or who retrieve relics of no tactical value. There are stories of tomb worlds whose walls are inscribed with vast, unreadable poems, whose glyphs match no known Necron lexicon. Some Mechanicus archivists believe these are remnants of Necrontyr literature, impressions of thought patterns too complex to be fully erased. The Necrons do not remember their sorrow, but they reenact it. Occasionally, a Necron lord will speak of names no record can verify. They address long-dead foes or give commands in extinct dialects. Some obsessively recreate cities from memory. Ruins turned into strange facsimiles of Necrontyr capitals that existed long before the war in heaven. These acts are not strategic, they are ritual, they are grief, and grief, unlike code, cannot be overwritten. Even the command structures of Necron dynasties echo their past. The triarchal format persists in some enclaves, despite its redundancy in a machine empire. Honor duels, once tools of political mediation, are still conducted between Necron nobles, beings who should feel no pride, no shame. But they do. Some ancient codes run deeper than logic. Some identities cannot be fully deleted. Beneath the polished armor and the glowing eyes, the Necrontyr whisper still. Perhaps the most tragic reminder of the Necrontyr's persistence is in Sarek himself. Though absent from the galaxy, his legacy endures. Some Necron dynasties revere him not as a ruler, but as a mythic figure, a silent symbol of purpose. Others curse his name, recalling his betrayal not as fact, but as ancestral ache. Whether worshipped or reviled, the memory of Sarek continues to shape their behavior. It is a mythos not encoded into them by the Cetan or the Biotransference, but something older, something human. In the end, the Necrontyr did not vanish. They fractured. They diffused. Their pain became protocol. Their art became architecture. Their sorrow became strategy. The Necrons are machines, yes, but haunted ones. Haunted not by spirits, but by themselves, by what they were, by what they lost. And in those rare moments when a Necron pauses longer than necessary, or gazes at a ruin just a second too long, one wonders, do they know? Do they remember? Or is the act of forgetting itself their final, most cruel punishment? Speculation in Warhammer 40k is a sacred tradition. The galaxy is a tapestry of might-have-beens, of cursed paths taken and blessed ones forever out of reach. Few races embody this tragic potential more deeply than the Necrontyr. Before their descent into mechanical damnation, were there other roads they might have walked? Could a different choice have saved them? Not just from the Cetan, but from themselves? The most common theory among fan circles is the path of coexistence with the Old Ones. Had the Necrontyr approached them not with wounded pride, but genuine humility, might the ancient masters of the warp have shared their knowledge? The Old Ones were not cruel. They were distant, yes, perhaps arrogant, but not innately hostile. If the Necrontyr had offered alliance instead of ultimatums, might the Old Ones have aided them? Some believe a genetic correction, a warp-gestated cellular repair technique, could have been developed. A healing, not a war. Of course, this presumes the Necrontyr were capable of humility. Their very culture, built on pride, memory, and rage, was shaped by cosmic injustice. It's possible they were never psychologically capable of that level of self-abasement. Their plea for help was always tinged with a demand for recognition, a cry not of need but of wounded superiority. Could such a people ever kneel and mean it? Another hypothetical path lies in the stars themselves. What if, instead of seeking salvation through external forces, the Necrontyr had turned inward? Some scholars suggest that within their own genetic code lay the blueprint of adaptation. That over millions of years, evolution might have naturally selected radiation-resistant strains. If they had simply waited, perhaps finding stable worlds, slowing their expansion, they might have become something else entirely. Not immortal, but whole. A patient, enduring people rather than a desperate one. But patience was never the Necrontyr's virtue. Their suffering was too immediate, too visceral. Every child born under their star was a countdown to death. Evolution could not outpace agony, and so they rushed forward, always forward. A darker alternate path is one in which they embraced entropy. Instead of fighting their fate, they might have chosen aesthetic extinction, a culture dedicated to dying beautifully, meaningfully. A ritualized, artistic culture that accepted mortality but defied it through memory. Had they followed this path, perhaps the Necrontyr would have become the galaxy's eternal mourners. Dying, yes, but never forgotten. Preserved in monument, legend, and mystery. Their legacy might have inspired other species, their artifacts scattered across time as reminders that greatness does not require immortality. This is the romantic theory, the tragic poet's vision. In it, the Necrontyr become martyrs rather than monsters. But there's little evidence they ever saw beauty in death. Their entire society was one of defiance, not acceptance. They hated death. They did not paint elegies, they carved warnings. The notion of a Necrontyr choosing peaceful decline feels alien, if not insulting to their memory. And what of Sarek? Could the Silent King have made a different choice? He could have refused the Tan. He could have taken his people into isolation, sealing their tomb worlds not in preparation for mechanical resurrection but in somber finality. They might have faded, yes, but with dignity. He could have chosen oblivion over damnation. But would his people have followed? Could a leader tell a dying species to die quietly? Perhaps the most disturbing theory is the one that suggests the Necrontyr's fate was inevitable. That the war in heaven, the discovery of the Tan, the Biotransference, it was all the result of a cosmic equation. Given their biology, their psychology, their place in the stars, the Necrontyr could only ever end this way. Not a tragedy of choice, but of design. A race born to be the architects of their own doom. And if this is true, then what does that say of hope? Of redemption? If the Necrontyr could not avoid this fate, despite all their intelligence and will, what hope is there for any race? This line of thinking is seductive, but it may also be the most dangerous. It strips agency from the dead. It tells us that Sarek had no choice, that the Necrontyr were always doomed. But there's a reason fans return to these what-ifs. Because in them lies a different kind of faith, not in gods or machines, but in the possibility of choice. The Necrontyr chose, that choice destroyed them, but it also means they could have chosen otherwise, and perhaps somewhere in the stars, something still remembers that. In the black between stars, the tomb worlds sleep. Beneath layers of stone and metal, behind cryptic glyphs and eldritch energy barriers, they wait. The Necrontyr are no more. What walks the galaxy now are their shadows, cast in living metal, silent, unsleeping. The Necrons do not speak of their past, because they cannot. Most do not even know they had one. But the galaxy remembers, and in that remembrance lies a terrible, quiet grief. The story of the Necrontyr is not one of villains, not truly. It is the story of pain so vast, so deep, that it could not be endured. A story of a people born cursed, who clawed at the very fabric of the universe seeking justice, and in doing so, became monsters. They were not consumed by hate, they were consumed by despair. Their fall was not a collapse, it was a surrender. Not to evil, but to inevitability. And yet, there is something profoundly human in that tragedy. The need to matter, the refusal to be erased. The desperate belief that something, anything, is better than fading away. That impulse is not unique to the Necrontyr. It echoes in every corner of the galaxy, in every Imperial shrine, every Xenos relic, every Astartes monument. The need to endure, to defy death. The Necrontyr did endure, but they lost themselves in the process. Their tombs stand eternal, yes, but inside them are ghosts who cannot remember their names. Wars rage around their sleeping worlds, but the Necrons do not care. Not unless they are disturbed. Not unless the silence is broken. And when it is, they rise, not with wrath, but with duty. A duty they no longer understand. Orders they no longer question. Marching to a music long forgotten. And somewhere, beyond the void, Sarek watches. Still searching for something that might undo the wound he inflicted upon his people. A cure not for sickness, but for soullessness. The last king of a dead race, seeking resurrection not of flesh but of meaning. If redemption is possible in the grim darkness of the far future, perhaps it lies with him. Or perhaps not. Because the galaxy is not kind. It has no time for sorrow. No space for regret. It rolls forward on tides of war and madness, and those who fall are forgotten. But sometimes amidst the fire and ruin, an inquisitor uncovers a monument with no explanation. A tech priest discovers circuitry that weeps. A guardsman sees a metal warrior hesitate before delivering a killing blow. And for just a moment, the veil slips. And the Necrontyr, broken and buried beneath 10,000 years of silence, are seen once more. This is why we remember them. Not to excuse, not to mourn, but to understand. To grasp the shape of the tragedy that shaped one of the galaxy's greatest horrors. Because even monsters have histories. Even machines were once men. And in the cold, quiet halls of the Necron tombs, a question still echoes. A question born not of conquest, but of grief. Who were we? And what did we become? There is a kind of silence not born of emptiness, but of restraint, of memory so painful it refuses to speak. In that silence lies a question even darker than regret. Not what was lost, but what remains. For the Necrons, there is no resurrection of the Necrontyr. But what of the space between what they were and what they became? What survives in that void, unspoken, half-deleted, flickering like corrupted code? There is a ghost in the machine. Not spiritual, but historical. Not mythic, but emotional. This section of their story lives in glimpses, in fragments. And sometimes, those fragments bleed through. Among the dynasties, certain figures stand apart. Necrons who should not be as they are. There is Trazyn the Infinite, a collector of histories, obsessed not with conquest but with preservation. He hoards memories, artifacts, echoes. Why? What impulse drives a being without emotion to build a museum of the past? Perhaps something in Trazyn still remembers what it meant to be Necrontyr. Not consciously, not directly, but emotionally, instinctually. His collections are not just trophies, they are acts of longing, of desperate, compulsive remembrance. Then there is Oricon the Diviner, who plays with time like an artist, seeking to bend the future to his will. But to what end? What does a machine empire, devoid of desire, gain from prophecy? Oricon's pursuits are not utilitarian, they are obsessive. His calculations are not merely scientific, they border on ritual. He speaks in riddles in ancient mathematical liturgies. This is not mere ambition. It is faith distorted through logic. He is not seeking power. He is seeking meaning. There are even rumors of Necron nobles who gather in darkness, not to plan war, but to speak in extinct tongues, reciting oaths they no longer understand. Some tell of tomb worlds where unbroken lords have built chambers filled with sound, attempting to recreate the sensation of breath, of speech. There are those who carve statues of themselves, not as they are now, but as they were, fragile and human, with lines of age etched lovingly into stone faces. These are not acts of madness. They are acts of mourning. The Necrons do not dream, but some of their stasis crypts pulse with strange energies. Internal logs from Imperial explorators suggest that certain tombs show signs of neural flickering, ghost signals that resemble the patterns of dreaming brains. These anomalies are dismissed by the Mechanicus as residual functions, but others whisper a different truth, that some Necrons remember in their sleep. Not in words or images, but in sensation, in longing. The shape of a cradle, the sting of sunlight, the memory of a name never spoken. And then there are the disobedient. Not rebels in the human sense. There is no rebellion without agency. But there are Necrons who do not follow orders as they should. Some hesitate, some override commands, some choose not to fire. The Silent King himself feared these occurrences, not because they threatened his rule, but because they hinted at something he could not control, the persistence of identity. If a machine can choose not to obey, what does that make it? If a Necron can remember who they were, even briefly, does that not prove the soul was never entirely lost? What does it mean to be a race defined by what it has forgotten? The Necrontyr built an empire to defy time. They recorded every death, every dynasty, every thought. They carved memory into stone. But memory, like flesh, proved mortal. And now the empire they built is a skeleton without a voice. Yet these small acts, Trazen's collections, Oricon's prophecies, the whispers of half-broken lords, are proof that something endures. The Necrontyr are not truly gone. They are scattered, shattered, encoded in anomalies. Memory became malware, legacy became glitch. But even in digital dementia, meaning finds a way. This is the irony of the Necrontyr's greatest failure. They sought to escape death, and in doing so, became timeless, but in a way that erased the very thing they wished to preserve. They wanted permanence. But permanence without memory is not legacy, it is limbo. Their tombs do not honor the past. They trap it, mummify it, sever it from emotion. Yet even so, something leaks through. A statue carved by a flayer with preternatural accuracy. A cryptek rebuilding a ruined city from ancient schematics without knowing why. A lord who pauses at a star system he once called home, staring into its light without understanding the pain behind the gaze. These fragments are not redemption. They are not even hope. But they are proof of what was. And maybe, just maybe, they are also proof of what still could be. That somewhere beneath the metal, beneath the programming, beneath the scream of biotransference and the silence of the void, the Necrontyr still whisper. Not loudly, not clearly. But enough to be heard, enough to be mourned, enough to matter. The Necrontyr's fall was not merely technological or civilizational, it was metaphysical. They crossed a threshold that no other species in the galaxy has dared, not because it was hidden, but because it was too visible. They stared directly into the abyss that separates life from unlife, and when it stared back, they invited it in. The consequences of that crossing were not limited to their own race. Like a dying star collapsing into a black hole, the Necrontyr's transfiguration pulled the galaxy inward, altering the gravitational current of fate itself. To understand this, one must think not in terms of material, but in terms of presence. Before biotransference, the Necrontyr had a psychic signature, weak, tortured, but present. Every race exerts pressure on the immaterium, the warp, even those who deny it. The Necrontyr's pressure was one of despair, a low, constant thrum of sorrow that warped the local immaterium into something inert, quiet, dim. After their transformation, that pressure vanished. The Necrons are psychically dead, not just silent, they are nulls. And that absence is not passive, it's a wound, a tear, a kind of anti-memory in the psychic fabric of reality. Entire systems now echo with that silence. Astropaths avoid tomb worlds not because they are dangerous, but because they are wrong. Ships that pass near them report dreams of erasure, of unbeing, of voices whispering, "We do not belong." Some scholars of the Ordo Xenos believe that the Necrontyr's death birthed a new kind of void, not just in the warp, but in the narrative of existence. A blank spot where once a story had meaning. The loss of a race's soul is not merely personal, it is cosmic. This is why the Necrons are feared not just as enemies, but as omens. They are not the vanguard of destruction. They are the aftermath. They are what remains when hope decays completely. No chaos god claims them. No psychic entity speaks their name. They are beyond damnation, and perhaps that is the most terrifying thing of all. Because in this universe, where every soul is fodder for gods, the Necrons are reminders that even the gods are not inevitable. But the universe does not forget easily. In the deepest parts of the Noctis Eterna, during moments of temporal instability, strange phenomena have been reported, echoes of voices speaking in a language no longer known. Recordings played backward on Mechanicus data slates have produced harmonic structures matching ancient Necrontyr mathematical sequences. Entire warp storms have calmed suddenly in the presence of Necron artifacts, not due to power, but due to absence. It is as if the very memory of the Necrontyr has become an antimemetic force, stripping reality of noise, emotion, even self. In these moments, Inquisitors speak in hushed tones of the unmade path, a theoretical construct, a metaphysical corridor leading to a possible timeline in which the Necrontyr chose differently, a timeline where they embraced life or art or peace. The very idea is heretical, for it suggests that fate can fracture. But in a galaxy defined by causality, the Necrontyr remain a singular anomaly, beings who unchose themselves. And what of the Katan? Shattered though they are, their remnants still drift through the cosmos, imprisoned in weapons, in machines, in stasis vaults. They too were altered by the betrayal. Once radiant star gods, they are now broken minds, each shard remembering only fragments of their former majesty. Some whisper that the Katan were not the origin of biotransference, but merely the mirror, an externalization of what the Necrontyr already wanted. That Sarek did not forge a pact with alien gods, but with his own race's shadow. That the star gods were birthed from Necrontyr despair, shaped by expectation, given form by grief. If true, then the Necrontyr did not simply fall. They created the abyss into which they would fall. In this light, the Necron tomb worlds are more than catacombs. They are shrines to a broken truth, that a species can will itself into extinction, not by war or genocide, but by surrendering its soul. And if that truth can exist once, it can exist again. This is why the Adeptus Mechanicus studies Necron tech with awe, but also with dread. Why the Black Templars speak of the Necrons not as foes, but as pariahs cursed by pride. Why even chaos itself recoils from them. They are not merely unliving, they are unbeing. A template for oblivion. And yet there is one final mystery. In the outer voids beyond the edge of known space, there are signals, weak, rhythmic, almost like a pulse. Not Necron code, not Titan resonance, something else. Something that resembles the early biosignatures of Necrontyr life, twisted, evolved, but undeniably organic. Could it be that somewhere in some forgotten outpost or sealed stasis vault, a pocket of unaltered Necrontyr survived? Could their blood still flow? If so, what would they think of what their race became? Would they rejoice, or would they weep? This question cannot be answered, but it matters that we ask it. Because in a galaxy ruled by war, madness, and gods, the tragedy of the Necrontyr remains a rare thing. A silence that cannot be ignored, a void that speaks, a tomb that weeps. And perhaps if one listens closely enough, there is still a voice in that silence, saying not we are lost, but something even more haunting. We remember. In the vast theater of the 41st millennium, where war is unending and the stars themselves bleed, there are few who pause to consider the meaning of those they destroy. The Necrons are not understood by the Imperium. They are feared, yes, feared like the void, like radiation, like extinction. But they are not known. To most, They are ancient machines. Remorseless engines of death that awaken to claim worlds with silent cruelty. But those who have stood in the shadow of their tombs and lived to tell the tale know differently. They know the Necrons are not just predators. They are echoes. The Inquisition knows this. Quietly, secretly, the Ordo Xenos maintains vaults filled with Necron artifacts, fragments of architecture, corrupted memory crystals, pieces of necrodermis engraved with symbols that defy translation. Tech priests whisper heresies in binary prayers, trying to decode the aesthetic patterns woven into Necron constructs. Some report emotional feedback. One Adeptus Mechanicus Magos allegedly burst into tears upon deciphering a sequence of harmonic structures embedded in a Necron obelisk. The code, when played through a Vox resonator, produced a haunting tone that mirrored a human funeral hymn. The Adeptus Astartes, for their part, view the Necrons with a respect born of necessity. Space Marines understand honor, even in enemies. And in the Necrons, they sometimes glimpse distorted reflections of themselves, duty twisted by time, oaths bound to nothingness. Veterans of long campaigns against Necron forces have spoken of duels that feel ceremonial, of adversaries that seem to mourn as they kill. There are records of Necron lords sparing defeated foes, not out of mercy, but ritual. Actions that make no sense in war, unless they are reenactments. Ritual echoes of a culture that cannot forget what it is forbidden to remember. Even the Eldar, ancient and arrogant, fear the Necrons for reasons deeper than battle. Their memories are long, and their souls more attuned to the warp's murmurings. They feel the hole the Necrons have left in the psychic fabric of the galaxy. Eldar Farseers speak of the wound that will not heal. They claim that where the Necrontyr once were, the warp recoils, like flesh around an old scar. Some believe that the fall of the Necrontyr cursed the webway itself, tainting its branches with echoes of unlife. There are entire sections of the webway that the Eldar have sealed off, not from chaos, but from something deeper. Something older. Something silent. And what of ordinary humans? What of the guard regiments who stumble into Necron tombs, who witness their dead rise, who hear voices not in their ears but in their bones? Some never return. Others do, but changed, hardened, quiet. There are stories of guardsmen who, after surviving a Necron campaign, begin carving symbols into their armor. Not Aquilas, not unit insignia, unknown glyphs, angular and alien. When asked why, they say only, "It helps me remember." Remember what? They do not know. These encounters matter, because they reveal a truth often overlooked in a galaxy of monsters and miracles, that memory is infectious. The Necrontyr's grief did not end with their death. It spilled outward. It seeped into the architecture of their machines, into the protocols of their constructs, into the very void between stars. That grief touches those who come too close. It does not kill, it lingers. It wraps around the minds of the living, not as knowledge, but as weight, as pressure, as a question without words. Some Imperial scholars have theorized that this effect, this psychic residue of mourning, is what protects Necron tombs. Not their defenses, not their guardians, but their presence. The unease they provoke is not strategic. It is spiritual. The galaxy itself resists remembering them. The universe recoils from what the Necrontyr became, not because it is evil, but because it is a mirror. And then, there are the few, too few, who try to understand. Rogue traders who preserve Necron relics not as curiosities, but as artifacts of history. Radical inquisitors who argue that studying the Necrons is not heresy, but duty, that by understanding their fall, we might avoid repeating it. There are even rumors of cults, fringe orders within the Adeptus Mechanicus or the Adeptus Sororitas, who believe the Necrontyr were victims, not enemies. Martyrs of a forgotten sin. They speak of the Grey Saints, figures of iron who walk not to conquer, but to mourn. These perspectives are dangerous, and perhaps they are wrong. The Necrons do kill, they do conquer. They are not benevolent, they are not seeking redemption, but they are also not mindless. They are not machines in the true sense. They are ruins with wills, tombs with agency, memory that walks, and that makes them more than threat. It makes them tragedy incarnate. Because in every Necron lord who stares too long at a battlefield, in every cryptech who builds something eerily beautiful, in every warrior who hesitates at the sight of a child, there's a question. A question so terrible it cannot be asked aloud. A question that infects those who face them. What would we become if we lost what makes us us? And that in the end is the legacy of the Necrontyr. Not their war machines, not their tombs, but their question. Their shadow, their echo, still moving, still mourning. There is a strange truth in the galaxy. The further back a memory fades, the more it begins to resemble myth. The Necrontyr were once a people of facts, of records, of cold legacy carved into stone. But time, especially 10 million years of it, does not honor precision. It dissolves it, and what remains are not histories, but legends. And what are the Necrons then, if not the bearers of a dead people's myths? Machines? Yes, but machines who move according to patterns older than themselves. Patterns that hint at something almost religious, almost sacred, long after faith itself was burned away. It begins with the architecture. Necron tombs are not merely functional. They are cathedrals to memory. Vaults upon vaults lined with hieroglyphs, some comprehensible, many not. Glyphs that repeat in cycles, not unlike prayer wheels or litanies. There are chambers with no obvious purpose, save for acoustics, rooms designed to resonate with sound and frequencies humans cannot hear. Explorators who've survived these places report feelings of weight, of ritual, as if they were not intruding on a military installation but a sanctuary, and perhaps they are. Not for a god, but for a grief so vast it needed holy ground. Among the Necrons themselves, there are behaviors that defy explanation, except through the lens of forgotten faith. Some units refuse to step on certain symbols etched into the floor. Others anoint their weapons with unidentified oils before battle. Still others leave battlefield offerings, scraps of metal, broken parts, even enemy helmets, arrayed in geometric patterns that match ancient Necrontyr burial rites. These are not programmed behaviors, they are inherited reflexes. Instincts passed down, not genetically, but ritualistically through error loops, copied code, and recursive memory echoes. Then there are the dreams. Yes, dreams. Though the Necrons do not dream in the human sense, there have been recorded instances of dormant Necron units activating briefly, cycling through memory banks in ways that suggest vision, sensation, narrative. The Mechanicus calls these ghost loops. But some, especially those who have encountered multiple tombs, speak of a different pattern. That across dynasties, across sectors, certain phrases, symbols, and sequences repeat, almost like scripture. One such symbol resembles the image of a dying star encircled by 9 broken rings. Another resembles an open eye with no iris, surrounded by rays that point downward instead of outward. These symbols have no tactical purpose, no known linguistic content, but they appear again and again. On sarcophagi, on pylons, even on the internal cortex walls of Necron lords. The theory? These were once religious icons, or perhaps more accurately, post-religious symbols of transcendence. Echoes of a faith born not in reverence of gods but in worship of memory itself. What would a Necrontyr religion look like? It would not be one of salvation or damnation. It would be a belief system built around lineage, honor, and endurance. A cosmology where the highest virtue is to be remembered and the greatest sin is to be forgotten. Death was never the enemy, it was obscurity. And so their rituals became preservation, their prayers became architecture, their saints became dynastic forebears whose names were sung not in reverence but in warning. Do not vanish, do not fade. This system, stripped of its emotional content, remains in the Necrons. You can see it in their hierarchy, in the obsessive maintenance of dynastic titles, in the preservation of useless ceremonial structures, in the fact that some cryptexts still create devices that do not serve war, but illumination, spires that glow in impossible patterns, sky altars that pulse when the stars align. These are not strategies, they are relics of belief. Memory fossilized into routine. And on rare occasions, the Necrons do something inexplicable. They defend planets with no resources, no tactical value, simply because those worlds were once holy to the Necrontyr. They spare defeated foes who display a certain gesture, a hand sign long lost to the rest of the galaxy. They cease fire during specific stellar alignments, or perform synchronized movements that resemble dances or dirges. No command prompts these actions. No program initiates them. They happen because they must. Because somewhere, deep in the corrupted neural lattice of a dead civilization, the soul of a ritual still beats. Some imperial theologians, particularly those considered radicals, have begun compiling these behaviors into a new field of study, post-organic religion. a belief system enacted by entities without belief, a church without priests, without gods, without prayer, only repetition. These thinkers argue that the Necrons are not atheistic. They are the remnants of a faith so old and so broken it no longer recognizes itself. And in that, they may be closer to the divine than we understand. Because what is faith, if not the insistence that something matters, even when logic fails? There is no cathedral for the Necrontyr, no living cleric to interpret their rites. But if you walk the tombs with eyes open, you begin to see it. The sacred geometry. The liturgies etched in stone. The stories told not in words, but in arrangement. And though the Necrons themselves would deny it, would not understand it, would perhaps destroy you, for said truth remains. The Necrontyr did not just die, they canonized themselves. And in every echo of their movements, in every corridor of resonant stone, in every gesture and glyph and glitch, their broken gospel endures. If you felt the weight of that question, if this story has stirred something ancient in your soul, then join us. Subscribe to the channel. More tales of sorrow, glory, and grimdark wonder await. Because in this universe, the past never dies. It merely waits to be remembered.